The heat in the town of Redemption was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from dust and disappointment. For Lynn, sitting on a splintered crate at the edge of the makeshift auction platform, it felt like a second skin, sticking her thin cotton tunic to her back, making a mockery of the dignity she fought to maintain. She was a ghost here, a specter in a borrowed body, her own life having ended months ago alongside her husband, buried under a mountain of rock and railroad ambition. All that remained was his debt, an iron collar she now wore. The auction was not for a person. The territorial laws were squeamish about such things. It was for a contract of indenture, a piece of paper that represented 5 years of her life, sold to the highest bidder to cover the cost of a passage from Guangdong and a debt that grew like a weed in this barren soil. Her hands, resting in her lap, were still. She had forced them to be. Inside her sleeves, her knuckles were white, her fingernails digging into her palms. She kept her gaze fixed on a single object placed on the auctioneer's block, a simple, woven bamboo basket. It was hers, one of the last things she had from home. The railroad agent, a man named Silas Croft, with a waistcoat that strained against his belly and eyes like polished river stones, had declared that some tangible object must be auctioned. It was a farce. Everyone here knew what was truly for sale. The basket was just a prop to lend a veneer of civility to the transaction. They were bidding on the labor her hands could provide, the years she had left, all symbolized by an empty basket that held nothing but the scent of a world she would never see again. The crowd was a stew of stale whiskey, sweat, and casual cruelty. Faces swam in the shimmering heat, haze, leering, curious, indifferent. They were prospectors with grit ground into the lines of their faces, ranchers with eyes narrowed against the perpetual glare of the sun, and town merchants whose softness was a different kind of armor. They looked at her the way a man looks at livestock, assessing her strength, her health, her pliability. She could feel their appraisal crawling over her skin, 1,000 tiny insects of judgment. She had learned enough of their tongue to understand their murmurs. "Small," one said. "Might be tougher than she looks," another countered, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust near her feet. Croft cleared his throat, his voice a booming, greasy thing that coated the air. "All right, settle down. We've got a special lot today. A contract for 5 years of labor, fully bonded, and paid for by the Transcontinental Railroad. All debts to be assumed by the winning bidder. The subject is proficient in domestic duties." He gestured vaguely toward Lynn, not quite meeting her eyes. "Let's start the bidding at $20 for the contract, and the basket is yours to keep." Silence. It was a heavier thing than the heat. The drone of a fly buzzing near her ear became a roar. $20 was the price of a decent horse, and a horse did not need to be fed 3 times a day or housed. A horse did not carry the ghost of a dead husband or the burden of a foreign grief. The silence stretched, becoming a humiliation more profound than any insult. The crowd shifted. A few men chuckled. Croft's face, usually ruddy with self-importance, began to darken with irritation. He had expected a quick sale. He had paraded her through the town's single dusty street like a prize sow, and now his prize was being ignored. "Come now, gentlemen," he wheezed, his joviality fraying at the edges. "This is a bargain. Think of the work. Cooking, cleaning, mending." His eyes flickered over her again, a little more pointedly this time. She did not flinch. She had learned the stillness of stone. To show fear was to invite the wolves. Still nothing. No bids. The basket sat on the block, a monument to her worthlessness in this new world. The sun beat down, seeming to focus its intent on scorching the very hope out of the air. She felt a strange, cold detachment settling over her, a recognition that this was it. This was the bottom. From here, there was nowhere left to fall. If no one bid, Croft would simply take her back to the railroad camp, where her fate would be far worse than servitude in a single man's home. $15 then, Croft barked, his desperation showing. $10 for 5 years of a life. Someone give me $10. The silence that answered him was colder than a winter wind. The crowd was no longer amused. They were embarrassed. The spectacle had become pathetic. Lynn closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, preparing herself for the walk of shame back to Croft's wagon. Then, a voice cut through the oppressive stillness. It was not loud, but it had the quality of rock and earth, a low resonance that made other sounds seem thin and frivolous. $100. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled, searching for the source. Lynn's eyes snapped open. Standing at the back, near the shaded entrance of the livery stable, was a man. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone, rather than the fleshy bulk of men like Croft. The sun had weathered him, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth, tanning his skin to the color of worn leather. His clothes were functional and faded, denim worn thin at the knees, a flannel shirt patched at the elbows. A dusty, wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was not looking at Croft, he was looking at her. Croft's jaw worked silently for a moment, his mind struggling to catch up. 100, he stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning avarice. I have a bid for $100. His gaze swept the crowd, a challenge in it. Do I hear 110? The crowd was utterly still, their leering curiosity replaced by a stunned respect for the sheer audacity of the bid. This was not the price for a servant. This was the price of a small herd of cattle, a down payment on a plot of land. It was a statement. The man at the back of the crowd did not move. He simply waited, his posture relaxed but radiating an immovable stillness. No one dared to counter. They knew this was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. $100 going once. Croft's voice regained its oily confidence. Going twice. He slammed a meaty fist down on the block, making the little basket jump. Sold to the gentleman in the back. The transaction was a blur of movement and murmurs. The rancher moved forward, his stride long and unhurried. He ignored the parting crowd, his focus entirely on the auction block. He counted out the money, not in crumpled bills, but in heavy gold coins that chimed as he laid them on the wood. The sound was clean and final. Croft scooped them up with a greedy haste, his earlier humiliation forgotten. He scribbled a signature on the indenture contract, the scratch of his pen loud in the sudden quiet. The rancher took the paper without looking at it, folding it once and tucking it into his shirt pocket. Then he reached out and picked up the bamboo basket. He turned, the crowd parting before him again, and walked directly to where Lynn sat on her crate. He stopped a few feet from her, the space between them charged with a silent, uncertain energy. He held out the basket. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but his gesture was not rough. She looked from the basket to his face. Up close, the shadows under his hat did little to soften the harsh lines of his life. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, gray and deep and unreadable. They held no pity, no lust, none of the things she had seen in the eyes of other men. They held only a quiet, waiting gravity. She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had been bought. Her life was no longer her own. But this man, this was not what she had expected. Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, she reached out and took the basket. Her small, slender fingers brushed against his rough, sun-warmed ones. The contact was brief, a spark of warmth in the cold landscape of her reality, but it sent a tremor through her. He gave a single curt nod, then turned without a word. "My wagon is over there," he said, his voice still that same low rumble, gesturing with his head toward a sturdy buckboard hitched near the livery. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. A complication arose almost immediately. Her legs, stiff and trembling from hours of forced stillness, refused to obey her. When she tried to stand, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted violently. She stumbled, her hand flying out to steady herself against the crate. The rancher, who had already started walking away, stopped. He did not turn around immediately, but she saw his shoulders tense. He stood like that for a long moment, a silhouette against the blinding sun, as if weighing a decision. Then, with a sigh so quiet it was barely a sound, he turned back. He walked to her, his shadow falling over her. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply stood before her, waiting. It was a test. She knew it instinctively. To accept help now would be to confirm the weakness they all saw in her. To refuse it, to find her own strength, was the only currency she had left. Drawing a ragged breath, Lynn pushed herself up, using the crate for leverage. Her legs shook, but they held. She stood before him, small and fragile in her foreign clothes, but upright. She clutched her basket to her chest like a shield. A flicker of something. It might have been respect. It might have been nothing at all. Passed through his storm-gray eyes. He gave another one of his curt nods and turned again, leading the way to the wagon. She followed, her steps small but steady, the dust of redemption puffing up around her worn slippers with every footfall. The journey had begun. Leaving redemption behind was like shrugging off a fevered garment. The cacophony of the town, the drunken shouts from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the greedy whispers of men like Croft, faded into a dull hum and then vanished completely, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. The only sounds now were the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, the groan and creak of the wagon wheels, turning in the dusty ruts of the trail, and the sigh of a hot wind moving through the sparse, thirsty grass. The man, her purchaser, her new master, she did not know what to call him even in her own mind, handled the team with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, making small, precise adjustments that the horses seemed to understand without protest. He did not speak. He had not spoken a single word since telling her where his wagon was. The silence stretched between them, a wide, barren country of its own, mirroring the landscape that unfolded around them. Lynn sat on the hard wooden bench, her back straight, her basket held tightly in her lap. She kept her eyes forward, watching the endless expanse of earth and sky. The land was a brutalist painting rendered in shades of brown and ochre, broken only by the pale, washed-out green of sagebrush and the occasional skeletal form of a yucca plant. The sky was a vast, merciless bowl of blue, so bright it hurt to look at. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the canvas wagon cover, turning the space beneath it into an oven. There was no shade, no respite, only the relentless, shimmering heat that warped the air and made the distant mountains tremble like a mirage. The environment itself felt like an antagonist, a living entity with a will intent on grinding all life down to dust and bone. She stole glances at him when she thought he was not looking. He seemed a part of this landscape, carved from the same hard materials. His profile was stark, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if reading a map invisible to her. He was a man accustomed to solitude. It wrapped around him as comfortably as his worn coat. She observed the way his eyes constantly scanned the terrain, missing nothing. The distant spiral of a hawk, the flicker of a lizard's tail on a rock, the subtle change in the texture of the dust that might signal softer ground. He was vigilant, a watchman in his own desolate kingdom. This was not the carelessness of a man like Croft. This was the deep, ingrained competence of a survivor. The observation did not lessen her fear, but it began to change its texture, twisting it with a thread of reluctant curiosity. For his part, he seemed profoundly aware of her presence, though he gave no outward sign. He could feel her stillness, the rigid control she exerted over herself. He had seen women fresh from the East arrive in this country before, women of far sturdier stock than she appeared to be. They wept, they complained about the heat, the dust, the sheer emptiness of it all. This one did not. She sat as still as a porcelain doll, enduring the jolting ride and the suffocating heat without a sound. Her only movement, the slight tightening of her grip on that ridiculous bamboo basket. He had not intended to buy a person today. He had ridden into redemption for salt, flour, and a new axe handle. But the sight of her on that block, the quiet, defiant dignity in the face of such raw humiliation, had struck a chord deep inside him, a chord he thought had rusted away years ago. The $100 bid had been an impulse, an act of rebellion against the casual cruelty of the world. Now the consequence of that impulse sat beside him, a fragile, silent question mark he had no idea how to answer. Hours passed. The sun began its slow, grudging descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The heat lessened, but a chill began to creep into the air, a reminder that in this land, the extremes were never far apart. The man finally pulled the team to a halt beside a meager trickle of a stream lined with a few gnarled cottonwoods. The horses lowered their heads to drink, their lips making soft, sucking noises in the quiet. He climbed down from the wagon without a word and unhitched a canteen from his saddle. He filled it, drank deeply, then refilled it. He walked around to her side of the wagon and held it up to her. It was not a question or a command, just a simple offering. His face was still unreadable in the gathering twilight. Lynn looked at the canteen, then at his hand. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and dry. She had been rationing the water in her own small flask, not knowing when she might get more. She reached out and took the canteen. Her fingers were numb, and the cold metal was a shock. She drank, the water tasting of iron and earth and life itself. It was the most profound kindness she had been shown in months. She drank until her thirst was quenched, then screwed the cap back on and handed it back to him. "Si, she whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "Thank you." He paused, the canteen halfway to his belt. He looked at her, and for the first time, the impenetrable mask of his expression shifted. It was a subtle change, a slight softening around the eyes, a momentary easing of the hard line of his mouth. He seemed to understand the meaning, if not the words themselves. "Caleb," he said. The name was rough, like stones grinding together. "My name is Caleb." He did not ask for hers. He simply stated his own, a piece of information given freely. Then he turned, tended to the horses, and climbed back into his seat. The moment of connection, if that is what it had been, was over. He clicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward again, rolling deeper into the vast, darkening wilderness that was now her home. They arrived at his homestead under a canopy of stars so bright and numerous they seemed to tear holes in the fabric of the night. There was no moon, and the darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that pressed in from all sides. The silhouette of a small, solid cabin emerged from the gloom, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney to dissolve into the starlight. Beyond it stood a larger barn and a web of corrals, all of it nestled in a shallow valley that offered some protection from the endless wind. It was a place of profound, almost terrifying isolation. The nearest neighbor could be a day's ride away or more. This was not a home. It was an outpost on the edge of the world. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He climbed down and moved to the back, unlatching the tailgate. He did not help her down. He lit a lantern, the sudden flare of yellow light pushing back the immense darkness and casting long, dancing shadows. In its glow, she could see the homestead more clearly. It was Spartan, built for function, not comfort. The wood of the cabin was weathered to a silver gray, the stone of the chimney dark with soot. Everything was neat, orderly, and stark. Her heart, which had been a tight knot of anxiety all day, sank further. She was his property now, brought to his isolated lair. Here, miles from any law or witness, he could do as he pleased. She braced herself, clutching her basket, her mind racing through the few desperate options she had left. None of them were good. Caleb finished with the horses, then picked up the lantern. He looked at her, still sitting in the wagon, a small frozen figure in the encroaching night. "Come," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. She slid off the bench and landed softly in the dust. She followed him, her feet unsure on the uneven ground. He did not lead her to the main cabin as she had feared. Instead, he walked past it, toward a second, much smaller structure set about 50 yards away. It was little more than a shack, originally built, perhaps, for storage or as a temporary shelter. But as he pushed the door open, the lantern light revealed something unexpected. It was a single room, but it was clean. A narrow cot was made up with a thick wool blanket. A small table and a single chair stood against one wall. A stone fireplace, swept clean, held a stack of freshly cut kindling and logs, ready to be lit. On the table sat a tin plate with a piece of bread, a chunk of cheese, and a dried apple. Beside it was a pitcher of water and a cup. It was a provision made in advance, a gesture of preparation and care. Caleb stepped inside and placed the lantern on the table. The light filled the small space, making it feel less like a shack and more like a sanctuary. He turned to face her, his large frame nearly filling the doorway. "This is yours," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "The door has a lock on the inside." Lynn stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. A lock on the inside. It was a simple mechanism of wood and iron, but its meaning was profound. It was a grant of privacy, of safety. It was a declaration that he was not her captor. It was a gesture of honor so stark and unexpected in this brutal land that it brought tears to her eyes. She fought them back, refusing to show such weakness, but the knot of fear in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a bewildering sense of reprieve. He saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the slight tremble of her chin. He looked away, his own discomfort with emotion a palpable thing. He gestured toward the main cabin. "I live there. You are not to come to the main house unless you are invited. I will leave wood and water for you each morning on the porch. Food will be left here." He paused, as if the words were unfamiliar stones in his mouth. "You are safe here." With that, he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. She heard his footsteps receding in the dirt, then the sound of the main cabin's door opening and closing. And then, silence. A silence different from the one in the wagon. This was a silence of solitude, not of tension. It was the silence of safety. She moved to the door and touched the simple wooden bolt. She slid it home. The solid thunk of the wood settling into its brace was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She was locked in, but she was the one who held the key. She leaned her forehead against the rough-hewn planks of the door and finally let out the breath she felt she had been holding since she stepped off the boat in San Francisco. A single dry sob escaped her, a sound of grief and exhaustion and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. The days that followed fell into a silent, predictable rhythm. It was a language spoken not with words, but with actions. Each morning, just before dawn, Lynn would be woken by the sound of an axe splitting wood. Peeking through a crack in her cabin's shutters, she would see Caleb's silhouette moving in the pre-dawn gloom, his movements efficient and tireless. He was a man in constant motion, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, working the stubborn soil of a vegetable garden. He moved with a relentless energy, as if stillness itself was a threat. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, a stack of firewood and 2 full buckets of fresh water would be waiting on her small porch. There would be no sign of him. It was provision without presence, care without contact. Later in the day, she would find other offerings. A pail of milk still warm from the cow, a few eggs nestled in a bed of straw, a cut of salted meat wrapped in butcher paper. He was providing for her, fulfilling his duty as her... what? Her protector, her keeper? The words did not fit. She spent those first weeks in a state of watchful quiet. Her fear, which had been a roaring fire, had banked to embers of caution. She watched him from the safety of her window, her analytical mind, the one her scholar husband had so carefully honed, taking over. She was no longer just a frightened woman. She was an observer, gathering data. She noted the way he spoke to his horses, his voice low and gentle, in a way it never was with people. She saw the patience with which he coaxed a sickly calf back to health, sitting with it through a long, cold night. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of dusk when he thought he was alone, she would see him stand by a pair of simple wooden crosses on a low hill overlooking the valley. He would just stand there, his hat in his hands, a statue of grief so profound it seemed to suck the very color from the air around him. She began to understand that his isolation was not a choice born of cruelty, but a fortress built around a wound. Inside her small cabin, Lynn began to reclaim herself. The space was a blank canvas, and she began to fill it with her own existence. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were pale and clean. She mended the blanket with thread pulled from the hem of her own tunic. She found a patch of viable soil behind her cabin, and using a sharpened stick, began to cultivate a tiny garden of her own, with seeds saved from the dried apple he had given her, and wild herbs she recognized from the hillsides. These small acts were not chores. They were declarations of agency, a quiet rebellion against the passivity that had been forced upon her. She was not just a mouth to be fed. She was a person creating a life within the narrow confines she had been given. One afternoon, while exploring a small shed behind the barn, she found a box of discarded things, old tools, scraps of leather, and at the bottom, a small, intricate carving of a bird, its wing broken. It was beautifully done, but clearly unfinished, abandoned. Beside it was a set of whittling knives. She took them back to her cabin. That evening, by the light of the fire, she carefully mended the bird's wing with a sliver of wood and a drop of pine sap. Then, on a separate piece of scrap wood, she began to carve. Her father, a guard for a wealthy merchant, had taught her the art of carving intricate puzzle boxes as a way to steady her hands and focus her mind. The muscle memory returned, and as she worked, the feel of the knife shaping the wood was a comfort, a connection to a life before the railroad, before the debt. A week later, she had finished carving a small, perfect replica of a hawk she had seen circling the valley. That evening, when Caleb came to her porch to collect the empty milk pail, he found the carving sitting on top of it. It was not a payment. It was not a gift of supplication. It was an offering, a bridge across the silent gulf between their two worlds. It was a statement. I am more than you think I am. I have skills. I have a past. I am a person. He picked it up. He stood there for a long time, turning the small wooden bird over and over in his rough hands, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the precision of the cuts. He looked toward her cabin, its windows dark. He did not say anything. He simply took the carving and walked back to his house. The next morning, on her porch, beside the usual provisions, sat a small leather-bound book. It was a book of English poetry, its pages worn and softened with use. The true turning point came several weeks later, as the first hints of autumn began to tinge the air with a crisp chill. Lynn was outside tending to her small patch of herbs when Caleb approached her directly for the first time since her arrival. He stopped a respectful distance away, holding a piece of paper in his hand. It was the indenture contract. She straightened up, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, her hands automatically wiping the dirt from her fingers onto her apron. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "This paper," he began, his voice raspy from disuse, "says I own your labor for 5 years. He held it up for her to see the official stamps and Silas Croft's florid signature. "It is a lie." He walked over to the small fire pit she used for cooking. He knelt, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the contract. The paper curled, blackened, and then caught, the flame greedily consuming the ink and the lies it represented. He held it until the fire licked at his fingertips, then dropped the last burning scrap into the pit, where it dissolved into a fragile black ash that the wind immediately scattered. He stood up and faced her. "You are not my property. You are not my servant. You are a free woman. I bought that contract so that man, Croft, could not own you. That is all." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast, unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. "Winter is coming. It is dangerous to travel. You are welcome to stay here, in that cabin, for as long as you need. When the spring thaw comes, if you wish to leave, I will give you a horse and provisions to get to the nearest settlement." He looked at her, his expression holding a question he did not know how to ask. He had given her freedom, but he had also framed her continued presence as her own choice. Lin looked from the ashes of the contract to the hard, honorable face of the man before her. In his world of silence and action, this was a speech of profound significance. He had not just freed her from a piece of paper, he had given her back her personhood. "I will stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had offered a choice of her own. "I will earn my keep." Caleb simply nodded, the briefest of acknowledgments. He turned and walked back toward the barn. The matter settled. The silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the shared silence of two people who had reached an understanding, a partnership forged not in law or contract, but in the crucible of a harsh and lonely world. The first snow came early, not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent assault. It began as a whisper on the wind, a sharp, biting cold that smelled of ice and distance. Within an hour, the sky, which had been a clear, brittle blue, curdled into a uniform, menacing gray. The wind rose to a howl, a hungry wolf's cry that tore at the corners of the cabins and whipped the first flakes of snow into a blinding, horizontal fury. The world beyond the valley dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Caleb had been preparing for it all morning, his movements urgent. He had secured the cattle in the barn, reinforced the shutters on his house, and chopped enough wood to last a week. He was on his way to Lin's cabin with a final armload of logs when he saw them. 3 riders emerging from the swirling snow at the mouth of the valley, dark figures struggling against the gale. They were not neighbors. No one would be out in this. He dropped the wood and sprinted back to his cabin, his hand already on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle that leaned just inside the door. He peered through a crack in the shutters. The riders were closing in. The man in front was bulky, his form familiar even through the blizzard. Silas Croft. The 2 men with him were strangers, hard-faced men with rifles held ready across their saddles. They were gunmen. Lin had seen them too. The sight of Croft's silhouette sent a lance of ice through her gut that was colder than the storm. Her brief sanctuary was about to be violated. She saw Caleb run back to his cabin, saw the glint of the rifle. She knew what this was. Croft had not forgotten the $100 or the public humiliation. He had come to reclaim his property. Caleb's front door flew open. "Get in here!" he roared over the shriek of the wind, his voice a thunderclap of command. Now there was no time for hesitation. Lin gathered her skirt and ran, the 50 yards between the cabins a treacherous landscape of whipping snow and freezing mud. The wind tore at her, trying to pull her off her feet. An instant before she reached the porch, the first rifle shot cracked through the storm, the bullet thudding into the log wall of Caleb's cabin just inches from the door. She threw herself inside, stumbling onto the floor as Caleb slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into place. The world outside vanished, replaced by the relative quiet of the cabin, the howl of the wind now a muffled, menacing presence. The room was dim, lit only by the low fire in the hearth. It smelled of wood smoke, gun oil, and Caleb's own scent of earth and solitude. It was the first time she had been inside his home. It was as Spartan as she had imagined. A large main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, a bed in the corner, and shelves filled with practical items. But on the mantelpiece, stark against the dark stone, sat the small wooden hawk she had carved. "Stay down," Caleb ordered, his voice tight. He moved to the window, peering through the narrowest of cracks. "He brought hired guns." "He thinks I belong to him," Lynn said, her voice shaking slightly as she pushed herself up into a kneeling position behind the heavy table. "He thinks wrong," Caleb growled. Another shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window shutter. He didn't flinch. "They'll wait for the storm to get worse, try to freeze us out or burn us out when we're blind." He was reloading the Winchester with methodical calm, his hands sure and steady. He had another rifle, a heavy Sharps, lying on the table along with 2 pistols. It was a formidable arsenal for one man, but they were 3, and they were outside, with the storm as their ally. Lynn watched him, her mind working with a cold, desperate clarity. The fear was there, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. But beneath it was the focused resolve her father had drilled into her. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. Observe, analyze, act. She looked at the layout of the cabin, the position of the windows, the single door. She looked at Caleb, a bulwark of defiance, but just one man. "You have another rifle," she stated, her voice quiet but carrying over the whine of the wind. Caleb glanced at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and dismissal. "You know how to cook, to clean, not how to shoot." It was not meant as an insult, simply a statement of what he believed to be fact. "My father was captain of the guard for the governor of his province," she said, her tone level. "He had no sons. He did not believe a daughter should be helpless." She met his gaze directly, her own eyes dark and unyielding. "He taught me to read the wind. He taught me to count my shots. And he taught me that the most dangerous place on a battlefield is wherever you are not." Caleb stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw past the small, quiet woman who carved birds and tended a garden. He saw the steel in her spine, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw a survivor, forged in a fire he couldn't imagine. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. Then he pushed the heavy Sharps rifle across the table toward her, along with a box of its big .50 caliber cartridges. "The back window," he said, his voice rough with a new, grudging respect. "It looks toward the barn. They'll try to get to the animals, draw me out, shoot anyone who isn't me." Lynn took the rifle. It was heavy, solid, its oiled wood and cold steel a familiar weight in her hands. She moved to the small window at the back of the cabin, her movements fluid and sure. She checked the action, her fingers moving with an ingrained knowledge that belied her delicate appearance. She was no longer just Lynn, the widow, the indenture. She was her father's daughter. They settled into a tense, waiting silence, 2 isolated figures against the storm and the violence it had brought. Hours passed. The blizzard intensified, reducing visibility to near zero. It was a waiting game, a battle of nerves. During a lull, a moment of profound vulnerability cracked through Caleb's stoic armor. He was staring into the fire, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with the men outside. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the name a ghost on his lips. "And my boy, Daniel." They were caught in a storm like this, on the way back from visiting her sister. "I told them to wait. But Sarah, she was stubborn, wanted to be home." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the flames as if seeing the memory there. "I found them 2 days later. The cold, it took them." He closed his eyes. "That's them, on the hill. I built this place for them." Lynn listened, her own grief a dull ache in her chest. His fortress of solitude was not a fortress at all. It was a mausoleum. For the first time she understood the depth of his wound and saw its reflection of her own. The loss of her husband, the loss of her world. They were bound by a shared language of grief. "I am sorry for your loss," she said softly, the simple, inadequate words carrying the weight of a shared sorrow. His eyes met hers across the dim room, and in that moment, the last wall of suspicion between them crumbled. They were no longer a rancher and his ward. They were two survivors, back to back against the darkness. The attack came just after dusk, under the cover of the thickest snowfall, a flicker of movement near the barn. Caleb saw it at the same instant she did. He raised his Winchester, but the angle was wrong. "Can you see him?" he hissed. "Yes," Lynn replied, her voice a calm whisper. She had already braced the heavy sharps against the window frame. She let out a slow, steady breath, the world narrowing to the rifle's sights and the dark shape moving through the white chaos. She did not aim for the man. She aimed for the lantern he was carrying, the one he intended to use to set the barn ablaze. She squeezed the trigger. The sharps boomed, its roar eclipsing the sound of the storm for a heartbeat. The cabin filled with the sharp smell of burnt powder. Outside, the lantern exploded in a shower of glass and flame, which was immediately extinguished by the snow. A man screamed, a cry of surprise and pain, clutching his hand. They had not expected a second shooter. They had not expected her. A furious volley of shots answered, hammering against the cabin walls like angry fists. Splinters flew from the shutters, but the attack was panicked, undirected. Lynn and Caleb communicated without words, a seamless dance of action and reaction. He would fire a shot from the front window, drawing their attention, and she would use the moment to track their new positions from the back. They were a team, a competent, unified force born of necessity. The lone, isolated rancher and the quiet, resilient outsider had become something more. They had become partners. The siege lasted through the night, a long, brutal war of attrition fought against both the gunmen and the storm. The wind never ceased its assault, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin, sealing them in a cocoon of wood and stone. Inside, the air grew thick with tension and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Lynn and Caleb moved in a quiet, efficient rhythm. Their earlier identities shed like old skins. He was no longer just the stoic homesteader. She was no longer the vulnerable widow. They were two soldiers holding a besieged fort, their survival inextricably linked. Caleb, accustomed to his solitude, found himself marveling at her composure. She was a rock. While he reloaded, she watched. When he fired, she was already scanning for the enemy's response. She tracked their movements with a hunter's patience, her whispers a precise report of their positions. One moving left, toward the woodpile. Croft is staying behind the water trough. She conserved her ammunition, making every one of the Sharps' heavy cartridges count. Each shot was not a panicked response, but a calculated statement, aimed not always to kill, but to control the battlefield, shattering a piece of cover, forcing a gunman to abandon a superior position. He saw in her the same discipline he imposed upon himself, an unyielding will to endure. For Lynn, the feel of the rifle in her hands was a strange homecoming. The terror of her situation was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but the focus required to fight pushed it into the background. She was acting, not being acted upon. In the crucible of the firefight, she found a fierce, exhilarating agency. She and Caleb moved around each other, in the dim light of the cabin, a choreography of shared purpose. When he passed her a fresh box of cartridges, his rough fingers brushed hers, and there was no awkwardness, only the simple, tactile reality of their alliance. The space between them, once a chasm of silence and uncertainty, had shrunk to nothing. It was filled now with the shared breath of survival. The turning point came in the gray, exhausted hours just before dawn. The storm had begun to